Hi, I'm Callie. I've been grading your week 2 assignments on FAA Enforcement, and I read through all of your responses to question number 1 out of the workbook, which posed a scenario about a pilot possibly inadvertently flying into restricted airspace, which of course is something you should never do. Looking through your responses, I wanted to go into a little more depth here because some of you seem to not be quite sure what the best way to handle this situation is, which would not be a fun situation for any pilot to be in. So first, the question says you're flying a private aircraft from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles under VFR, and you contact the LA Center to request radar flight following to the airport. The center gives you a transponder code so that they can identify your aircraft on radar, and a moment later the controller says, radar contact 3 miles north of the Mojave Airport. We have a report that you may have entered restricted airspace. Please give us a call at, and then a phone number. The first part of this A, what will you reply and why? You should always be nice to the controller, and as you know, you're required to respond to communications directed to your aircraft. So you should reply Roger, and then as long as the frequency space isn't overly congested, read back the phone number that was given to you. The book says it's an option of whether or not to call the number, and that's correct, but you still need to respond to the transmission from ATC and copy down that number. Next, what will you do once you arrive at your destination airport and why? First, you should tie down the aircraft, and now you need to decide whether or not you're going to make the call to ATC. I, as most pilots who have experience flying, have had this happen before, and it's a judgment call each time. It's not a black or white answer. If you think the call may clear up the situation, and you know that you are going to have enough self-control not to yell at that controller if that controller is annoying to you, then go ahead and make the call. However, you should not make the call if first you think you're going to be rude to the controller, because that call you make will be recorded. And if you're rude to the controller, now that's part of the evidence that the FAA can use to show that you have a non-compliant attitude. And second, you should not make the call if there's no way that the FAA can identify who you are. That really is only going to be the case if you're on a VFR flight and you didn't file a flight plan. If you file the flight plan, or if you're on an IFR flight plan, the FAA already knows who you are. Okay, next, after landing and tying down the aircraft, a person approaches you and says, FAA, are you the pilot of the aircraft? What will you reply and why? Many of you wisely said that you're going to ask to see identification from the FAA, which is a good policy post 9/11. You should be nice about this, and you might even joke a little and just say, hey, the TSA wants me to make sure that you are who you say you are, and the FAA will be happy to show you credentials. Assuming they show you the credentials and those check out, now you need to decide how you're going to respond. This may just be an FAA inspector who thinks your aircraft's cool. That's something you're going to have to decide based on their tone of voice and how they start the conversation. Remember, though, that the FAA does not have the authority to detain you, and a great policy to have is to just try to leave as quickly as possible. So you could say, hey, I'm really sorry, I'm already late to my next meeting or appointment. I can't stay and talk, but if you need to reach me, here's my business card, or here's my email address. That's a nice way to exit the situation. Next, under D, the inspector asks if he can see your airman and medical certificates, your aircraft registration, and airworthiness. Of course, you do have to present these to an FAA inspector, and you should hand the certificates to the inspector. We talked about in this week, I had you read a regulation that's called voluntary surrender of certificates. The purpose of that regulation is to explain when and only when you're actually surrendering your certificate. So physically handing your pilot's license and your medical to an inspector so that he or she can hold them and examine them is not surrendering your certificate. The inspector is not going to walk away with them. If you don't let the inspector hold them and you want to play tug of war or hold them and just let him look at your certificate when it's in your hand, you're just going to aggravate and agitate the inspector, and that's the last thing you want to do in this situation. Okay, the next one is the inspector turns nice, almost apologetic, and says he just needs to close out your file. As the book says, this is common phraseology that inspectors try to use to put you at ease. What you need to remember in this situation is to always be polite. So if the inspector pulls this on you, say, hey, I'm so sorry, but I've got to go. Here's my business card, here's my email address, please email me and I will be happy to help you out. And then you'll have some more time to think about it. If you want to contact an attorney, you can do so, and you can handle this over email where you're not going to be put on the spot and maybe more likely to inadvertently incriminate yourself or say something that just doesn't need to go into your file. Next, a few days later, you receive a phone call from someone who identifies himself as an FAA inspector. He's been assigned to the case and has a couple questions for you. You do not need to answer those questions on this call. So what I would recommend is that you write down his questions or ask the inspector to shoot you an email. This would then be a great time if you work for a company to contact your chief pilot and figure out how you're going to solve this together. Having a chief pilot maybe respond to that email for you or with you could go a long ways to showing compliance and showing the FAA that whatever potential violation happened will not happen again. And finally, the last subset question of this question 1J is a few weeks later, you receive a letter from an FAA inspector. Are you required to respond to the letter? If you do, can the response be used as evidence against you? You are not required to respond to the letter, but you do have 10 days to respond if you want to. Whatever you say in the letter can be used against you and will go in your file. So most of you in the question said you should not respond. My suggestion to you is always respond, but you don't have to say anything. So when I work with pilots at corporate flight departments who receive letters from the FAA, we recommend that the flight department respond on the pilot's behalf and say, "Dear FAA inspector, we are also investigating this potential violation, and any information you can provide us would be helpful for finishing our investigation." Something to the effect of that, where you admit nothing, but you have a polite response in the file. So just a couple things to think about when you're interacting with the FAA. Give me a call or send me an email if you have questions.